The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We're glad to be with you tonight. Glad to have you. Hope you're glad to hear us. This is a live call-in show. Please feel free to call in and voice your opinion or thoughts or challenges on the topic of the evening. 343-9927, 343-9927. And tonight we have a guest, Dr. Leslie Grover from Southern University. Dr. Grover, glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And as I said before, since I know you outside of the radio station, I'll have to call you Leslie, and I know you don't mind.
No, that's
because you're humble that way. But Leslie is a professor of public administration and public policy at Southern University, but you're also educated in lots of other things, too. And that's the kind of people I like to hang around with. But anyway, tonight's topic, as you know, Leslie, is the history of race riots in America and how they have influenced attitudes of people toward racial issues and things like that. And because a lot of times, instead of me talking about what I think, let me start with a quote here. This is from an essay or article written for the Alternet by a Chauncey DeVega, I think, but it's titled White America's Racial Amnesia, and he states here that he quotes Gore Vidal first as saying, quote, "We live here in the United States of amnesia. No one remembers anything before Monday morning. Everything is a blank. They have no history." And what Mr. DeVega said preceding that quote by Vidal is, white America is a country with a limited historical perspective and a very short-term memory. And he goes on to state that the American people are robbed of any meaningful social or historical context for the way people perceive race relations today. And things like the black people's response to Ferguson, Missouri, and in Baltimore, and a lot of these other things. Without knowing the history, people just naturally can't really understand. They don't have empathy. They don't understand it. They think it's bizarre or odd behavior. Why are people getting so upset about this one incident? That kind of thing. How does that make you feel? I mean, this quote here. Do you kind of share that perspective?
In a way, I do share that perspective because race is always a touchy subject, and of course, I dare not speak to what white people think, but it seems to me that a lot of the white people that I speak with, when we are comfortable talking about race, I think it stems either from embarrassment or weariness, because there's a lot of white people that would like to move past, racism without doing the work of unpacking a lot of the issues that go along with it. It's also a matter, I think, a part of white privilege. White people get the opportunity they can either become racial allies or get involved and talk about things, or they actually have the luxury to say, well, I don't know about that, and I don't, and I don't understand that, or I never heard of that, and it's okay. But as a black person and as a black scholar, I have to carry my history with me. My blackness is questioned. If I don't know the words to Lift Every Voice and Sing, it's like, what? If I don't know, a lot of the American history that we understand about black people, I have to carry that with me. I have to carry my ancestors with me. Of course, there's another quote and a song, "He ain't heavy, he's my brother." It's not a heavy burden for me, but I think a lot of times white America does not have to carry that burden in the same way that people of color, black people, brown people, Native Americans have to carry that.
No, and I would suggest, at least from my perspective as a white man, the white people that just want to move on and get past this race thing, they lack the historical perspective. I mean, like you're saying, what you just mentioned that you deal with it now, related to race issues, is entirely different from what my approach is going to be. In that, you're not even talking about the violence that's perpetrated on the black people and has been for this country's whole existence. You know, and continues on today in various forms. And, you know, there's a link that goes back hundreds of years. And so to me, there's a reason why black people get scared or get worried when someone gets out and starts race baiting, you know, like President Trump or candidate Trump and the Willie Horton thing with the Republicans back in the 90s, I think it was. I mean, and I didn't understand it back then, like I told you earlier. But now I see it. It's like when this is the kind of thing that causes riots, and that's my segue into the article that prompted me to suggest doing this show with you tonight, Leslie. This is an article titled, well, I don't want to tell you the title yet, but it's in, and I'm talking to the listeners now, this is in the spring 2017 issue of UU World, which is the magazine of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And Leslie, I'll read you a couple of paragraphs here. This occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. During a 16-hour rampage, a white mob gunned down or burned to death as many as 300 black people. An elderly couple shot in the back of their heads as they knelt praying. One of the most prominent black surgeons in the country was also shot with his hands up. More than 36 square blocks of homes and businesses in Greenwood, which was a subdivision of, well, it was the black section of Tulsa at the time on the other side of the tracks. The prosperous black neighborhood of the booming oil city burned to the ground after being looted by cheering whites. And then he says 10,000 black people were left homeless, and no one was ever prosecuted. And that struck me there. I mean, right there, to have that happen, just, you know, once, well, maybe, but, you know, I can go on. But then no one was ever prosecuted, and I want to get back to that later, because that's something that sticks in the craw, so to speak, to put it gently, of a lot of black people, because it still happens today.
Absolutely. You know? I think part of that, though, is, I mean, you use the term black people.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times when things like that happen, and historically, black people haven't been seen as people.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
Remember the 3/5 compromise. I mean, to go from property to people, you can burn down property, you can knock it down, you can rebuild it, you can sell it, you can leave it abandoned, you can move it around at will. And I think that the undercurrent of that way that black people were viewed still exists, because the churches, I mean, this Dylan Roof, the shooting when he went into the church in South Carolina and shot the praying black people, these were prominent black people. These were people who were contributors to the community. They were elderly. They sat and they prayed and they talked with him, and he still, you know, did what he did.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, gosh, let's just focus on the word people.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think once you can begin to see another person or a black person as a people, plural and singular, a real personage, the way you see yourself as a person, or how other white people view each other as people, because people don't even look at black people as equal sometimes, you know.
No, and actually, I had kind of the same comments made by the two Muslim gentlemen I had on the show a couple of weeks ago, and they pointed out that most of the people that are afraid of Muslims or have these stereotypes of them have never met any of them. They've never been around them. And that's the whole problem. And I want to bring up something that's related to what you said, but not really related to the show topic for the night. But it's my impression, and feel free to tell me if I'm wrong or you disagree, but when the television shows began in the 60s that included black people, you know, initially you had just the stars, you know, Sidney Poitier and, I can't think of the guy. He was a Jamaican, I believe.
Harry Belafonte.
Thank you very much, yes. But then you moved on to sitcoms that were all black. And I kind of wondered if maybe that was a major turning point in a lot of white people's attitudes, because now, hey, those people behave just like we do, you know, and they saw you as human beings instead of as these stereotypes that they've been fed all their lives, you know? I
think so. I think when, you know, I know that Bill Cosby is a controversial character. I know now I know he's got a lot going on, but I will say that the Cosby Show was a turning point for all of America, because the idea that two successful black people are living in a great house, living a great life, raising their kids, doing things that white people do and everybody does. It was so amazing that we put this on TV, which would lead me to say that my issue too has to do with the personage of black people always needing to be compared to that of a white person.
Right.
You know, that to me, that's the sticking place. That's where we lose again. That's where we lose the people.
Yeah,
the
and
peopleness.
Yes, and that's difficult because that is the essence of white privilege, so to speak. And someday we've got to do a show on that because there's a lot of misunderstanding regarding that too.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
but yeah, you know, white people are the so-called standard of judgment for everybody in this country because that's how it's always been. And it's just something, it's a human thing, I guess, and it's just hard to get around. But you mentioned the Cosby Show, and there were other shows, too, that showed upper middle class, successful, professional black parents, with kids and all that, and the issues they dealt with, how similar they were to everybody else's issues. And that was actually what was considered behind the cause of the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots. This section of Oklahoma called Greenwood was originally set out as it was considered poor, useless land, and that's why they let the black people settle there. And then oil was discovered on it, and the people began to thrive. And they had their own doctors, they had professional classes of all kinds of people, and they were doing a lot better than the surrounding white communities. And there was a lot of resentment with that. And in doing my humble research for this tonight, I found an article from Smithsonian.com about a long-lost manuscript that was an eyewitness account by an attorney, a black attorney, who lived in Greenwood or Tulsa, Oklahoma, and witnessed that whole thing. And hopefully I'll be able to get to some of his comments later, but his grandson is now a curator with the Historical Society there in Tulsa, and he's quoted here as saying that the cause of the riot, the whites rioting, or the pogrom, so to speak, much like there were Jewish pogroms, he says the issue was economics. He explains that Native Americans and African Americans became wealthy thanks to the discovery of oil in the 1900s and what had previously been seen as worthless land. But so it was all because apparently they were jealous or resentful because these blacks were getting way too uppity and doing better than they were. But I wondered, do you think it was just economics?
No, I don't think it was just economics. But, economics is the go-to because a lot of times when people discuss slavery or why the South seceded from the Union, it's like, well, no, it was an economic issue. It didn't have anything to do with race. It didn't have anything to do with that. But the truth is even if we look at the Greenwood case, even if oil and all these resources was at the root of the reason as to why the black people were beginning to do better than the surrounding white people, the white people over the ages have benefited from the slave labor and the subjugation and the violence and the incarceration. Let's go on, we got to say mass incarceration. Let's get it together from black people. And it's like it's very easy. One of the things about white privilege is it's so very easy to take that for granted because it's such a part of the ingrained culture of who we are as a country and of how we communicate and talk about race that it happens now. I was reading something on the way in about there's now beginning to be a movement of looking at extreme acts of violence and racism as a mental illness. And some of if we apply that to the Tulsa case, some people would say that the mental illness and the pathology of this white group was such that it led them to violence because it was a group of sick people. Like anger can drive us mad. Anger can drive us to violence. The passionate way in which they viewed their resources being taken or what they thought they may have deserved or whatever the trigger was, drove them to do that takes them beyond that.
Also, the mob mentality. I've experienced that. And, of course, having that many angry people with violent emotions all together, it just feeds on it and it rises exponentially. But the reason I asked about if it was just economic is because there was another pogrom that occurred in 1917. This was in East St. Louis. And what happened was, well, the first account that I read stated that it was sort of economic in that there were 470 black people that moved to the city to take jobs that were vacated by striking workers from the aluminum ore company. And, of course, these were striking white workers. And that created a lot of hate and discontent among the people. And so it was argued that that was why. But there was a book that I read titled American Pogrom, the East St. Louis Race Riots and Black Politics by Charles Lumpkins, where he points out that it wasn't just the resentment of the workers, which almost, striking workers have been violent against all kinds of, races.
Absolutely.
If they're going in and taking their jobs when they strike, and I empathize with that, to be honest with you.
That's fair.
But he says that it was because it was facilitated. These riots were facilitated by the white power structure because they feared these people gaining political influence and through economic power. And I wonder if that was a part of it in the Tulsa riot too. In fact, the manuscript that I mentioned, I got to find it here now, was written by Tulsa attorney Buck Colbert, I'm thinking Stephen Colbert, Buck Colbert Franklin. He lived through the riots, and he describes hearing what sounded like hail hitting the roof of his office building, and he noticed that, all of the big buildings that he could see from his office were burning from the roof.
Wow.
And he ran outside and saw burning balls of turpentine. And what it is, actually, I'm making this a short story long here. There were people flying over in airplanes and dropping these things on the city, on that part of town, burning the thing down. But and I thought to myself, getting back to this East St. Louis riot and the claim that it was the white power structure, poor people anywhere didn't own airplanes.
Yeah, I was going to say, where are poor people going to have?
Yeah, right.
I mean, find me some. I'd like to see how they did it.
Yeah, no kidding.
We have a lot to learn from them.
Yeah, but and that's. I mean, we wonder. It's like, well, was the Tulsa riot had to have some complicity there too?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, they both had a common theme also, as did another white riot I read about. But they both riots were ignited by rumors about black or a black-on-white crime. The Tulsa riot, the tensions were already there because of the disparities in the economics, and also, but then there was a story being circulated in the papers about a black man who assaulted a white female elevator operator, and he was charged, with the crime and taken to the local, jailhouse. And, of course, there was the uproar in the white community, so a bunch of black World War I veterans came down to the courthouse with guns to protect the young guy from being lynched, because we all know that was likely going to happen. And the whites showed up, and, of course, the shouting match and everything else, they had guns too, and so bingo, that touched everything off. But there was that there, and then in the East St. Louis riot, after they had a city council meeting where the whites were screaming about these dad-burn immigrants coming in and taking their jobs. Where have we heard that before?
Sounds familiar.
But after that meeting, there was a rumor being circulated, and I think it was put in the newspaper also, about a black man attempting to rob a white man, and that set things off.
But that's always the race narrative.
Well, that's my point, yeah.
That's it. And, even now, when I was listening to Trump a few weeks ago, talking about the creation of this voice office that deals with violent crimes committed by immigrants.
Right.
I just absolutely, I didn't. I just couldn't. I still don't have the words.
And that's a perfect example. You know, and of course, people who are know something about history.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, the Jews and the black people, and blacks know it, but they see that, they hear that sort of thing, and they know what it's capable of creating.
Absolutely.
And of course, the people who don't are like, you're overreacting. That's silly. You know, you're just too quick to call the race baiting card and stuff like that. But by the way, this is Wayne Parker with a pause for thought, coming to you from Baton Rouge Community Radio. I'm speaking with Dr. Leslie Grover from Southern University. We're discussing race riots. You're welcome to call in with your comments or questions, 343-9927, 343-9927. And something else along with the East St. Louis riot, actually, Leslie, followed the same pattern. There was an initial, eruption of violence, and things calmed down, and then it erupted again on July 2nd, 1917, and that's when it really got serious here. It says, men, women, and children were beaten and shot to death. Around 6 o'clock that evening, white mobs began to set fire to the homes of black residents. Residents had to choose between burning alive in their homes or running out of their burning houses, only to be met by gunfire. Thank you. In other parts of the city, white mobs began to lynch African Americans against the backdrop of burning buildings. And the interesting thing is, and I read in one of the articles about this riot that the National Guard was called in, and they deputized a bunch of white people, and it was the National Guard white deputies that caused a lot of the violence there, and they committed a lot of the crimes. But also, it states here that 6,000 black people were arrested for this white incited riot. Basically all the people that weren't already in jail, black people were put in jail as a result of this white riot here, and I'm like, come on,
But it sounds like typical overreaction, like this summer with the peaceful protests that went on after the Alton Sterling shooting, and black people were just over 100 black people peacefully were just taken in and charged with all types of stuff if they crossed a line or if they went forward, and the police were just dressed out in gear like Armageddon against unarmed black people who were exercising their right to protest something that they didn't like, to take a stand, to show some grassroots outrage about some of the things that were going on. And it was just a complete and utter overreaction. But then it gets back to not seeing someone as people. That's the way you would handle a dangerous animal who's rabid, who's going about the land, attacking people, a savage. And that's simply not the case. Those images that we have of black Americans and other people of color coming from that, it's ingrained in who we are. And anybody that even knows a little bit about their history, when they saw those images or when they knew that was going on in the city, it should have set off alarms about what the possibility of that type of way of dealing with people could happen. It just absolutely is something that we have to work on. We gotta address it.
Well, and here again, it's the lack of historical perspective, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And really, that could be at the heart of everything. If the white power structure, so to speak, to use a cliche, I guess, but if they were understood the roots of these problems and how police impunity with abusing, young black men today has a long history. I mean, that has a long connection for 200 or 300 years. That people have got away with that. I mean, like I said, the Tulsa riot, nobody was prosecuted, nobody was even arrested. And then in East St. Louis, they arrested all the black people, and...
well, it's the same way when you look at different types of police shootings across the nation, and that pattern, like the black person is always taken in,
Yeah.
Regardless, they're taken in, and, the white person, I think about the Trayvon Martin case.
Yeah.
And then when Zimmerman actually went back out and committed several other types of violence and still just, free to roam about the country. I know I've killed a person. I know that I've beaten my girlfriend or my wife or whomever it is. I know that I've gotten in confrontations, but I'm free.
Yeah, and as someone who hasn't spent his life dealing with that sort of thing and had relatives that dealt with that sort of thing, I have a friend, well, you have a friend too from church, whose great-grandfather, I think, whom he knew, was a slave. You know, and so that these connections, I mean, there are people living still today who have, you know, family connections back to slaves and knew those people. And so all these things still live in your minds and psyches, I'm sure. And white people, you know, unless they make the effort to learn some history and open their minds, aren't going to be aware of that. And hence, you know, their overreactions or their bafflement when black people get angry and riot or whatever, because they don't understand how serious this needs to be taken.
And really, to me, we haven't created a strong of enough incentive for lots of white people to do it.
I think that's hard.
We being not black people, but we being
those who
society,
want to make it better and know, you know, I mean, I don't claim to be as well educated as you are on the matter, but I know enough to realize that I should keep my mouth shut more than I open it regarding these things. You know, I don't, I back off on forming opinions too soon because I realize that I don't know, you know, as much as, you know, I could know, and, you know, about the situation. But I'd like to work in one more white riot here, if I may. And I was pleased when you told me that you had not been aware of this one. But this is from an article on Dartmouth Life, which is a blog of the alumni of Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. And it talks about, it says, for a few months in 1835, Canaan, which was 20 miles east of Hanover, a small town 20 miles east of Hanover, was home to the Noyce Academy. And it was an institution founded on the idea, revolutionary in pre-Civil War America. Yeah, it says 1835. That was pre-Civil War. I didn't catch that initially with that date, but it was even before the Civil War and desegregation and all that stuff. But it states here that it was founded on the idea that blacks had the same rights as whites to formal education. And so they created this academy, and the wealthy white people that supported abolition of slavery and all that paid their money into it, you know, and they wanted and approved of an integrated, you know, student body.
Right. And
there were 14 African Americans in the first class. But you know how I mentioned with Tulsa and East St. Louis, how the rumors about black on white crime and all that, you know, were used to inflame the rioters. Well, there were a lot of people who were nonplussed with this school, to put it lightly. And let me see here. Oh, yeah, okay. And so the local newspaper, when this school opened up, began running articles that stated a warning about young black men walking arm in arm with white women.
Oh, gasp.
Yeah, and I just thought, well, but this enraged a lot of the locals because they didn't want that. I mean, for goodness sakes, we haven't had the war yet, you know, and you're doing this to us. But
and before the birth of a nation, in 1916, when Woodrow Wilson, our president, showed this film at the White House, and furthered that myth of you know, black savage men attacking innocent white women and the Klan having to save them in their honor.
Right,
yeah.
Wow. Okay, but I wanted to give a quick description here. In August of 1835, just a few months after this academy opened up, hundreds of men from Canaan and surrounding towns, including Hanover, this is in Massachusetts, by the way, liberal Massachusetts, but hundreds of men launched an assault on the school. They arrived with 90 oxen, ropes, and chains, and working in shifts, they physically dragged the schoolhouse off of its foundation and destroyed it. And the students watched from the homes of the local townspeople with whom they boarded, and after destroying the school, the mob threatened the students and the people sheltering them by firing cannons near their homes.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is American history, and it goes back that far and farther probably, but that was all I had the time to go over. But you know, and there's things I think I told you before the show that when Willie Horton was brought up as the big bugaboo, I guess it was Dukakis was running and the Republicans ran it, you know, opposing him. You know, he's going to let Willie Hortons run all over the place,
Yeah.
and they're going to rape our white women, you know. And I was, or our right winger back then, and I couldn't understand why, you know. But now that I've done some reading and done some talking with people, I understand. Like, yeah, I can see why black people would be outraged, because not only is it an insult,
Yes.
but it can incite serious, you know, things, you know. And like we've seen since Trump's campaign against Mexican immigrants and Muslims, those, you know, crimes are on the rise now. Whites against, you know,
Yeah.
blacks and Mexicans, and also Jewish cemeteries being
lots
vandalized.
of
Yeah.
vandalization of.
Yeah, and Jews, they've been persecuted from time immemorial. I mean, I think I think it's because they're blamed for killing Jesus.
Yeah,
But,
that's usually the argument I've heard. Well, they killed Jesus, so we should kill them.
the funny thing was, it was the ruling religious elites of the day that had him killed,
Right.
because he was challenging them. They were the established religion of the day, the Pharisees that he called as the hypocrites. That Jesus, you know, Jesus was challenging them and saying, "You guys are a bunch of hypocrites. You're focusing more on action rather than the actual Word of God." You know,
Right. And so, you know, Jesus gave us the groundwork for empowerment and political activism and for kind of picking apart this system.
right? But yeah, and I guess I got myself railroad or sidetracked there. But anyway, Dr. Leslie, do you want to say anything else at the, you know, to close out the show? We got to get ready to get out of here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me today. It's always wonderful to be with you. But also, just to say that there's lots of work to do and lots of history that we all need to make sure that we don't repeat. And perhaps in no time, at least in my lifetime, has it been more essential, you know, to get involved and understand these things. Because we're in some dangerous times here with the dynamics that are going on in this country.
I agree, and there are still people who write in the Baton Rouge publications who don't believe that dialogue is truly free, and hopefully we can cover that someday. Anyway,
Absolutely.
You've been listening to Dr. Leslie Grower from Southern University and me, Wayne Parker, with the Pause for Thought, coming to you from Baton Rouge Community Radio. We thank you for listening. We got to go. You have a good night.